Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator for this panel. My name is Erin Murphy. I am the Gazette's Des Moines Bureau Chief, and this session is on school choice. It is within the policy track, although it obviously just as easily could have been within the education track. Our time together this morning will include talking with our four panelists who've been kind enough to join us. And we'll also address audience questions. So if you have any questions for the group, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them in the second half of our time here. And just as a quick note and reminder, all of our sessions do have closed captioning access and all of the sessions are being recorded. So thank you to everyone who has joined the discussion. Some of the names are familiar. I almost feel like we could be up at the State House right now instead of all on Zoom. But thank you to everyone who's here, and we hope more will catch this down the road, as this will eventually be posted online for folks to view afterwards too. And also want to extend my thank you now to our panelists for joining us, and let's meet them. Melissa Peterson is a government relations specialist for the Iowa State Education Association, which represents teachers and other educators across the state. Melissa, welcome this morning.
Good morning, Erin. Thank you.
Drew Klein is state director of the Iowa chapter of Americans for Prosperity, a conservative advocacy organization that has been supportive of school choice policies. Hello, Drew.
Hey, glad to be here.
Margaret Buckton is with Rural School Advocates of Iowa. Good morning, Margaret.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity.
And Trish Wilger is Executive Director of Iowa Advocates for Choice in Education. Good morning, Trish.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right. And so thank you again to all our panelists for this discussion and to all of you who are listening in. Let's get right to it. I want to just kind of start with the big picture view here. Give everybody kind of an opportunity to get us rolling on this topic of school choice. And obviously in Iowa here, the kind of focus of this topic is legislation that has been proposed by Governor Kim Reynolds that would create a new program that would create private school, taxpayer-funded private school tuition assistance for 10,000 students across the state. So let me just go right down the line and we'll go in the order that we introduced everybody. Tell us what is your most basic argument in support of or in opposition to Governor Reynolds' proposal. So Melissa Peterson with the Iowa State Education Association, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate on today's panel on this very important subject. The Iowa State Education Association believes firmly that the finite resources of the state ought to be spent to benefit the greatest number of students possible and to make sure that we can afford a quality educational opportunity for the nearly 500,000 students that we do serve here in the state of Iowa. We have seen many iterations of school choice / education savings account / voucher bills over the last several sessions. And quite frankly, we think we have a really good amount of our school choice already in the state of Iowa when we take into consideration the robust programming our public schools offer, whether that include the expansion of charter school legislation a couple of years ago, whether that takes into consideration the concurrent enrollment programs that our public schools offer. We think we have lots of school choice existing in the state of Iowa, and we would like to see additional resources utilized to help benefit all of the students that we serve in our public education system. And so that is kind of our premise for our opposition of the governor's proposal this past legislative session. We think it's also really important to reflect upon the impact that such a bill could have on all of our communities, particularly those that do not have access to non-public school options. And so While we appreciate parents should be at the center of making a decision on their educational experience for their students, we think that those taxpayer resources need to go to support our robust public education school system as opposed to further subsidize non-public school options.
All right, thank you for that, Melissa. Drew Klein with Americans for Prosperity.
Yeah, no, appreciate the opportunity to speak about this, and certainly we've been supportive of that broad array of school choice policies that have come forward over the course of the last several years, and certainly longer in Iowa, at expanding open enrollment and opening up charter school laws. I think this is the next logical step, but I think it also speaks to the broader need in education, is that we begin to really innovate and rethink what education looks like. And there are two main approaches that you can take if you want to go that route. We can allow bureaucrats and elected officials
Oh, so Drew, I apologize. It looks like we lost your audio there, so we'll give you a second to work with our folks back at the home base here and come back to you. I apologize for that, Drew. So let's go on next to Margaret Buckton with Rural School Advocates of Iowa. Margaret, give us your basic argument in support of or in opposition to the governor's proposal.
Thanks, Erin. Can you hear me all right?
I can. Knock on wood.
Okay. And I also, in full disclosure, have to say I work with the Urban Education Network, which is 22 of the largest school districts in the state too. And both the Urban Network and the Rural School Advocates of Iowa registered opposed to that bill. We have similar concerns as what Melissa with the State Education Association expressed in terms of funding, especially with the historic tax cut that was enacted this last session. So just a few years down the road, the nonpartisan budget estimate is a $1.8 billion loss of revenue to the state. And for the last 12 out of 13 years, our public schools have received a per pupil increase that's below their cost of doing the business of school. So this bill, the Notes on Bills and Amendment, also written by the nonpartisan budget staff, says there will be a loss of $79 million in state money that goes to our public schools. And there's also a loss of all of the property tax and local funding that goes to our public schools as a result of that enrollment shifting in another direction. So the context of that is, how do we set our schools up to be competitive for teacher pay that's going to keep people in the state of Iowa, that's going to provide good teachers to us. And our rural schools in particular are concerned if we have expansion of private choices, especially in the areas where there aren't private schools in those rural areas. We will tend to see an increase in the poaching of our good rural teachers to get jobs where that capacity is located. And we're already really struggling. The net result is a school could become unaccredited or have to consolidate.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. And Trish Wilger with Iowa Advocates for Choice in Education. Give us your opening thoughts.
Good morning. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic, which, of course, this is what we work on all year round. We were very much in support of Governor Reynolds' bill. We know that, we've had school choice in this country since 1991 when Milwaukee started. We've never seen a mass exodus of students or harm to public schools that came out of these programs, and they are all over the country. We've had an STO program here since 2006 that benefits kids, but we need to do more. Parents are looking for options. There are some options available to some parents right now. But depending on where they live, some of them don't have options. And we feel that the governor's proposal this last session made good strides in giving options to additional parents that would allow them to seek the best option for their child. We know that the majority of kids in the future are going to remain in the public school system. We want that system to stay strong like everyone else does. We don't feel that this program, with the small scale of it, compared to the amount that's spent on public education in Iowa between state, federal, and local funding, this isn't going to harm those systems. If children transfer from a public to a private school, there will be less children there. So there will be some funding that stays behind as a result of this, but also the school won't have the cost of educating any children that transfer. But we don't feel that it's detrimental at all to the public school system. It's going to give some parents options who don't currently have them. And we're behind the proposal.
All right. Thank you, Trish. And Drew, let's circle back to you. Hopefully we got you back online.
Does the audio work better now?
There we go. Sounds great.
All right. Very good. Well, yeah, and I certainly, echo a lot of what Trish has said. I think one of the things that we look at when we look at education policy broadly, and we don't work, simply in the education choice space, but kind of across the spectrum, and supporting a menu of options is really about driving innovation and finding a system that's going to work for every student. I talked to a number of educators, and I think one thing that we can all agree on is that not every child is the same, and they don't learn the same, and they need the options to meet their own needs. And I think we can either have a system that allows folks here in Des Moines with consolidated power to drive those innovations, or we can fund students directly and allow parents and families and students to drive the innovation that we want to see in education. And I think that's one of the best aspects of the proposal that the governor has rolled out.
Hey, Erin,
right.
could I comment on that, please?
Sure.
Because I agree with the importance of diminished regulation, and even our public schools being able to react to the needs of individual students. And we see lots of innovation going on, but it's under the direction of regulation that doesn't apply to the private schools. There is a phrase in that governor's bill that talks about the non-public school that accepts the funds from the education savings account from the parent is to be given the maximum freedom possible to meet the needs of that student. And I would sure love to see that phrase in our regulations for our public schools. So there are some things that we have to do. But I'll tell you, getting rid of that March 1st deadline for open enrollment really created an option that every single family has to open enroll into a neighboring public school district. So I push back a little on the fact that there just aren't choices.
All right. And Margaret, actually, we'll stick with you because my next question, I wanted to start off with you here. And you touched on it a little bit in your opening comments there. From a legislative standpoint, from a lawmaking standpoint, basically the only reason this isn't already state law, that it's still in proposal form, is because there are a few lawmakers who represent rural districts who have had concerns about how it would impact schools in their areas. I'll eventually bring everybody in on this, but I wanted to start with you, Margaret, since because of the group that you represent. Tell us a little, again, you touched on this, but tell us a little bit more about what some of the concerns you and obviously those legislators are hearing from those rural schools.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's an economy of scale that exists in our larger urban centers that doesn't exist in our rural centers. So if our rural schools were to lose 2 or 3 students, that takes with it the resource that would maybe pay for a teacher. But if they don't all come out of the same grade, and even the loss of 3 students, you still have to have that second grade teacher. So it makes balancing the budget difficult if you do lose students. Right now, we don't have a lot of private schools in many of our rural areas, as you stated. But with this proposal starting, and if it follows the track record of what happens in other states expanding, there could be a motive for private entities to come into rural areas and maybe create a career academy or a college prep course. And there's actually a story of one of those that happened in Oklahoma where an individual wanted to have that school, put it there with the funding available to them, and it attracted just enough students and all the teachers from those neighboring high schools that it created real difficulties for those schools. And it didn't last. 3 years later, it was closed, but it created some upheaval for them. But secondly, the funding in general, our rural schools are hurt the most when that per pupil cost doesn't go up enough. And we're concerned that the state hasn't adequately funded our public school system. So if they take on the burden of an additional education system, then that's something that goes in the education budget, and we will be competing for those dollars, especially given that looming tax cut.
Trish, well, let me ask you to respond to that. And you noted that, while schools would potentially lose funding if a student transfers to a private school under this, that would be manageable because they have fewer students to educate. But what, to Margaret's example there, in a small school, if 2 or 3 kids transfer out of a small school, that's percentage wise maybe a little bigger chunk of what their budget is, but they can't hire one less teacher now. They still have 22 kids in a class instead of 25. So what is your response to these concerns from the rural and smaller districts?
Well, the main impact, with a proposal like the governor's, occurs if a student leaves a school for a non-public option under the current proposal, or what we saw in the session at least. So if there are rural areas, I know it's come up, mentioned that there aren't any non-public schools in the area. So that option's not going to be there. No one's going to be able to transfer. In some of our counties, there aren't any non-public school options. So that wouldn't occur there. I think we have to look at providing the options to the parents, and what Margaret talked about, a private entity coming in, calls to mind the charter bill, and that was passed pretty easily. And that could happen under that charter bill, that a private entity could come in and do the same type of thing. But I think when we look at examples in other states, that overall, it hasn't had the negative impact. The sky hasn't fallen, that the public schools are still doing okay.
Drew Klein, you've done, sorry, I was just going to come to you. You've done a lot of lobbying and talking to people on this bill. When this concern is raised, what do you tell folks?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually a really good conversation, and I point to the fact that there are a lot of families that are already exercising choice in a way that, quite frankly, is far more harmful to the public school that they're leaving, and that's by simply selling one house and moving to a different house to get into the school that they want to be in. We see that happening regularly. It's happening in rural Iowa right now, and when that happens, every dollar leaves the school that they left. And now we see that funding move to the school that they're moving to. Under an ESA proposal, like we've been talking about, the public school actually retains a portion of the dollars that were there before when a student decides, or a family decides, that they want to consume their education somewhere else. And that happens through the PEPL fund. It happens through a number of other mechanisms, but it's actually a far less harmful financially structure for school choice than allowing families that have the ability to sell a home and buy a new home to go seek their education elsewhere.
All right. Trish has mentioned this, and this gets into a question that I had on. So Melissa Peterson, I'll start with you on this one. There have been programs, school choice programs introduced in other states that are much broader than Iowa's and similar to the one that's being proposed. And there's no conclusive evidence anyways at this point that these programs in other states have hurt public schools. So where is the concern? Why do you still have concern about this proposal?
Well, so a couple of things, Erin, related to your last question. I have to share, it's more than just a few legislators in the House that were resistant to the governor's proposal. There were many who joined with their colleagues on the other side of the aisle, which is why we were successful in preventing the governor's proposal from moving forward, because there is significant concern about access to some of these programs and the expense of those programs. That, again, we have to remember in context, we are working with a finite pie. right? With all of the important expenses that the state has to address when they're looking at it from a budgetary perspective. And we just think we need to be as responsible with those resources as possible and provide the greatest opportunity for the greatest number of students with those finite resources. Related to the impact on public schools and other states that have adopted programs, I would actually suggest we do have conclusive evidence that there are, frankly, a number of other states that have seen the extreme proliferation of investments into non-public education once they originally adopt some version of a voucher or ESA program. For example, in Wisconsin, which I believe Ms. Wilger pointed out, adopted their program in 1991, they have seen a more than 2,000% expansion of the program at a time when they're still struggling with adequate investment in public education. And so I think we need to be very, very conscientious about, again, making sure that we're providing the best opportunity for our students in all 99 counties. And I think you can see, particularly when we look at the different options, the innovative options we have in our public school districts and the partnerships that we are building with those communities, and then also looking at it from a larger perspective of all of the other challenges, frankly, our state is facing, whether it be migration towards urban centers, right? And other challenges our rural areas are facing. We need to be very cognizant of making sure we're not putting unnecessary pressures on some of those rural communities in particular. And that we are focusing, once again, our attention on benefiting the greatest number of students possible. And we are talking about a public education system that services more than 92% of our student population. And that's just where we believe we need to be focusing our attention.
Margaret, Buckton, did you have anything to add to that? The suggestion that there's and that Melissa disagreed with, but that there's not conclusive evidence out there in other states that these programs have harmed public schools?
Yes, we've seen some states where the funding for public schools has not kept up after this charter school or ESA or voucher expansion has taken place. We've seen some urban centers that had to close neighborhood schools in the public school because they no longer had the economy of scale that they used to have when they had those students. And I think about that student being able to choose who is the student that may be least able to afford to get to the private school and those kinds of things that I often hear the school choice advocates say champion this policy for. I still think that we have like a doubling of poverty in the state of Iowa. And we have those systems like the school tuition organization tax credit that's specifically targeted to an income eligibility level, in my opinion, too high, because it's 400% of the federal poverty level, which is $111,000 for a family of 4 in annual income. But we could use those tools more intelligently to create that limited policy option in places if we believe we need it, without risking the closure of a neighborhood school in an urban center or the lack of the ability of a rural school to be accredited.
All right. Drew Klein and Trish Wilger, I'm going to start with you on this one. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit here and there already as well. So there, as others have noted, there are some school choice programs already in Iowa. The school tuition that has been mentioned, charter schools. We have open enrollment now without a deadline, which is new from this past session. Students can open enroll at any point. So with those programs already in place, what is the need that this proposal, the Governor Reynolds proposal, is serving? Drew, we'll start with you. What students is this getting to? Who wouldn't already be able to take advantage of the systems already in place?
Yeah. Well, at the risk of diving into the vision of a state that doesn't yet exist, I think all of our school choice programs as they exist right now still keep education in individual silos. You choose a school, or you choose a district, or you choose a model. And I think by opening up the funding flexibility through ESAs, what you what you create is the opportunity for various education providers, public, private, charter, tutors, any number of other models to actually work collaboratively to deliver the education that meets the individual needs of each student, knowing that each student is unique. And I think that is, maybe the biggest difference between what exists right now, which is a menu of options, and really opening up a lot broader array of how we build education for individual students based on, their needs, their values, their long-term goals in life, their interests and aptitudes. How do we put all of that together to make sure that we meet the needs of every student?
Trish, Wilger, did you have anything to add to that?
I would just add that with the current school tuition organization or STO tax credit program, it still is unable to serve the need that's out there. There are still families that there's just not enough funding to go around. And especially depending on which STO you're talking about, there's 12 of them around the state. In certain areas of the state, the need is huge and there's just not enough funding to go around. So the ESA and the governor's proposal would add some options there, give more funding than families can get under the current STO program, and expand choice to some kids that currently aren't covered.
Melissa Peterson, what's the harm of expanding these menu of options, as Drew put it, that given an opportunity for even more students? And I should note too, this legislation is targeted for lower income families as it's written. So folks who theoretically would benefit most from this kind of assistance. What's the drawback to that?
So I appreciate lower income. I believe the last version of the governor's proposal was, again, to apply the similar standard to STO eligibility of 400% of the federal poverty rate, which again, I would argue is quite generous, as Margaret pointed out, at $111,000 for a family of four. So I will say we have not yet seen complete utilization of the STO with the increased cap of $20 million. So if there is greater need, let's have that conversation related to that tax credit, which is among the most generous in the country at 75%, by the way. But I think I would also like to just address the fact that choice is a interesting topic, but when we think about it, the choice is really, if we were to pass the governor's proposal, the choice would actually be left up to the non-public schools. Because what we haven't addressed in this conversation yet is the fact that these non-public schools, as the bill was previously written, don't have to take every student. It's in fact the non-public school that gets to make the decision about who they accept, which is significantly different than our public education system, where it is our honor and our responsibility to educate everyone who shows up on our doorstep of our school districts, our public school districts across the state. And so to create a separate system or to further subsidize that non-public education, it's actually a false choice, because the choice isn't that of the parents or the students. The choice would be that of the receiving non-public education or non-public institution. That's where the choice is. And I think that's something that we need to make sure is a part of this conversation.
Before I go back to Drew and Trish on that, Margaret, did you have anything to add on? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So Drew mentioned that some of the local money stays in the public school, but the students don't. They don't have to educate them. And really, there's so limited funding that stays there. It goes back to the local levies like the PEPL levy or the bond issue, those things that are already obligated. But what they will lose is the $1,200 per student in the sales tax, which also pays for infrastructure. So that PEPL is going to have to be stretched a lot further. And then all of the educational funding, the instructional support levy, dropout prevention funding, all of those things are tied to actually counting the student in enrollment. And that's the vast accumulation of what's in the general fund that pays for teachers and textbooks and all of the things that we think of in terms of education. But the last thing I want to mention, the school choice that we have in Iowa is so broad that the Heritage Foundation, through that Education Freedom Report card on the school choice metric, ranked Iowa 9th in the country in school choice options. And that was based on data and things available in 2018 and 19. And we've since created the charter school law and opened up open enrollment and doubled the tuition and textbook tax credit and increased the STOs to 20 million. And I think it's been moving so fast. It would do policymakers well to just breathe for a minute and see how those things are going to impact school choice before we invest in yet another derivation of something that I think we're already meeting the need
on. Drew, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to something that Melissa mentioned there about the private schools having the ability to, selectively choose who they accept in contrast to public schools. And I've heard that brought up in this discussion too. What's your response to that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a pretty simple explanation. I mean, I think most of the private schools and the education providers are doing what they can to meet the needs of the students that want to be there. But if they can't, then it would be irresponsible for, say, a private school to accept a special needs student whose needs they can't meet. One simple solution, I think, to open up that option to more special needs students is to make sure that ESA accompanies or encapsulates all of the dollars attached to that individual student. And so you think of some of our really high special needs students in the public education system today, there are a lot of dollars attached to those. If they have one-on-one para with them at all times, I think if we open up a system of ESAs that really make sure that every student has access to all of the dollars that are tied to their education, you're going to see those private providers and new providers pop up that will gladly find a way to meet those needs. And we see that happening in other states that started with say things like special needs ESAs only. You had providers that popped up and catered to meet the needs of that student population. I think that will be true in Iowa if we move forward this proposal as well. But I think it also gets back to that question of, how irresponsible would it be for an educator or a provider to accept a student whose needs they can't meet? And I think it's also a false premise. I mean, we know that there are examples where public schools have referred students to a different building or a different location because their needs can be met better at that location. We see that happening in public education already. So it's not the idea that anybody can just show up at any school, any public school, walk in and they will be accepted. We already see that shuffling happens in public schools. We will see, the individual needs and interests of the students align with providers, and they'll have those opportunities. It's happening in other states.
But with all due respect, it would not be required. It would not be regulated in that fashion. I appreciate we want to, suggest that would just naturally take place if they want to provide the best services. Unfortunately, if they do not have to follow the same regulations or accountability measures as our public school system, there is no guarantee.
And I would add, I'm sorry, go ahead, Margaret.
Sorry, Erin, one other thing to that. The special education weighting does follow the student if they have an individual education program or plan through special education through this ESA, the way the bill is currently drafted. The problem with that is that the parent is not required to use that money to reimburse the public school for the special ed support that federal and state law still requires our public schools to provide to special education students, even in a private school setting. And we could have a whole 1 or 2 hour session just on special education funding, but whatever isn't covered in the formula goes back on the local property taxpayer for special ed deficit. And we believe that's a real problem with the way this bill is structured, because our public schools will still serve those students. The parent will get upwards to $24,000 in their ed savings account for tutors and paras and other things, but they're not required to reimburse the public school district for those expenses. And lastly, if the private school decides in December it's not a good fit, that student goes back to the public school who no longer has the funding, and the parent's required to pay back any pro rata amount that should still be in their account to the state. It doesn't go to the public school. And I think that's a hiccup that we'll have to deal with, because we see students come back into the public school system from private schools, I'd say fairly regularly.
All right. Melissa touched on something there that was actually next up on my list. Trish, Wilger, I want to start with you on this one. One of the discussions I hear around this kind of legislation is how even though it's taxpayer funding that's going to these education savings accounts, the schools that are going to benefit from these are not held to the same academic and transparency standards that public schools are. What is your response to that criticism of this kind of program? If taxpayer funding is going to go to an education savings account and follow where a student goes, shouldn't there be that same level of transparency and accountability that there is in taxpayer funded public schools?
Well, I think we first need to point out that the private schools in this program, or in the STO program, and in the governor's proposal, are accredited non-public schools. This means that they do provide a great amount of information to the state. There are other states in the country where this doesn't happen. In Iowa, we're kind of unusual in that schools are either accredited by the state or by an accrediting agency that's approved by the state. So there is a lot of information provided by non-public schools in the state of Iowa. There's a great deal of transparency. Schools have boards and operating organizations that parents know what's there, and they're aware of what's going on. I think the greatest accountability, not only to the state and through the accreditation process, is that accountability to parents as well. That exists there, and I think that's a huge part of this equation that's very important to remember. So, a lot of non-public schools take a lot of students. They are accredited. That information is available. And I would argue that to say that they're kind of out in the dark and no one knows what's going on just doesn't hold water. There's a lot of information that's reported to the state in Iowa.
Drew Klein, how about that? And I've heard what Trish said about school boards and parents being able to talk, still hold those people accountable. But I mean, that's the case in public schools as well. And they have higher, levels of standards of, so what is your take on this argument, Drew?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually the best argument, though, on the accountability front, is the accountability that parents exercise in school choice. If we take it out of education for a period of time, like the accountability that Hy-Vee faces or Fairway faces over whether or not they're offering the products that I want and meet my need is exercised when I decide whether or not to shop there. And clearly education is different than shopping for groceries, but that's exactly what we see play out in this marketplace of education in other states. With all due respect, parents don't have that same level of accountability over public schools because they're captive to the funding formula. So parents that have the financial means have the ability to exercise, although they do so at great personal cost. Those that don't have the financial means, certainly there's a process. They can petition their school board. They can do all of those things, but they don't have the instant accountability for their child's education that they would have under an ESA model. And I think that opens up the issue, and there will be further policy discussions around to the point that I tried to make earlier on the collaboration between public and non-public education providers. I fully support the idea that the public schools should be able to utilize some sort of tuition model if they're providing some of those services back to those families and students. That also further feeds that accountability mechanism where parents are exercising accountability.
Melissa Peterson, where on this general topic of transparency and accountability, what's your thoughts?
Yes, I will say that the governor's proposal was specific to those accredited non-public schools, but that accreditation is not tied back to explanation or transparency around where those funds that would come with the ESA would actually be spent. We would not be able to evaluate what elements were being funded and what weren't. I will also say that the boards of non-public schools are not elected and accountable to taxpayers the same way that our public education system is. And in fact, I would argue, parents have lots of access, as much access as they would like related to our public education systems. You ask any public educator anywhere in any district how many times they receive communication from parents, whether it be via email, many of them through a CASA or Canvas texting system, right? You can communicate with administrators of public education systems, our parent-teacher, conferences. We are accountable, we are transparent, and we want to make sure that, again, where those taxpayer resources go, that we can ensure that they are delivering the best outcomes. And again, I have to push back on this idea that people are stuck in their existing public education system. With the number of modifications and school choice options we have expanded in this state, going back to Margaret's point, we are ranked very highly nationally when it comes to options for education in the state of Iowa with that STO program, with the expansion of open enrollment. And so, again, we just need to make sure that we are we're exercising a great deal of fidelity when we are expending taxpayer resources and making sure that those finite resources are going to benefit the most number of students and provide the best quality public education or education experience possible in an accountable and transparent fashion.
Margaret, Buckton, did you have anything to add that hasn't been covered yet on the issues of transparency and accountability?
Yeah, I just think that it's an interesting intersection of public policy levers right now, with the original governor's bill last year also increasing transparency for parents. And it started out with saying any taxpayer, any citizen could see the curriculum being taught in a public school. And you contrast that with the language in the bill about the non-public schools that could receive the ESAs, although they're accredited by a different accrediting agency. That doesn't mean that parents or taxpayers have access to any of those things, the curriculum, the library books, et cetera, like we're talking about for public schools. And I just think it's a little bit of I'd call it a double whammy for public schools to have to endure a heightened level of regulation at the same time as there is suggested we need more competition with others. The last thing I wanted to mention is there are so many studies out there, and we could spend hours talking about those too, about how states benefit, how public education benefits, how competition makes everybody better. And there are different theories about all those things. And I just go back to the fact that we have so much school choice in Iowa. Before anybody draws conclusions about what's going to happen in Iowa with this bill, it's important to look at the fact that we probably already have those policy levers in place to create the impetus for having the best possible public schools that we could have.
All right. One thing I wanted to ask everybody, and Drew Klein, I'll start with you on this one. We're on our way out, knock on wood, mostly of a pandemic that early on had a huge impact on our schools, one of the biggest impacts anywhere. And education, it seems like, has been viewed through a different lens in a lot of ways for a lot of different people ever since then. I'm wondering, based on your conversations with people, and I'll get to everyone on this, but Drew, like I said, I'll start with you. Do you feel like the pandemic has affected or moved the needle on Iowa families' perspectives and views on school choice?
Certainly. I guess that's the short answer. I mean, think of the families that were, essentially forced into being homeschool families overnight by the pandemic. And as a father who has homeschooled kids, I understood the challenges of that. And that was something that we took months and months to prepare for and get ready for with our own kids. It certainly exposed parents to the challenges of education. And I think some of that to the benefit of teachers. They had a new appreciation of the tough work that teachers do on a daily basis as well. But it also brought them face to face with curriculum that maybe they had never seen before. And you have parents relearning how to do long division and all of these other challenges. But they also found lots of other things. And I think it exposed them to this notion of like, well, gosh, now I see what it takes. I see what we're teaching, and they were exposed to a whole bunch of other options simultaneously. And I think that has created an environment where more parents are looking to see what else is out there. Obviously, our schools, I think, did fairly well from the state level. I thought we had policies that allowed the schools to be able to continue to educate. And in many cases, that's exactly what we saw. But you still had this new environment in where parents were exposed to a whole bunch of new information that they weren't before. And I don't think that was the result of anybody withholding information. It was kind of forced upon them. It was just put on the table in front of them every night as they were, working through their kids' schoolwork with them.
Melissa Peterson, I go to you next. How do you feel the pandemic has changed in any way Iowans' views on school choice?
I agree with Drew. I think that this created an opportunity for folks to see exactly the hard work that does go into educating our students every single day. And I will say the pandemic in general, I think not only within the education sphere, but across the entire country, frankly, it exacerbated other challenges that we already saw happening prior to the pandemic. And so it really put a magnifying glass, I think, on different challenges that we have. I will say, I think it also did highlight some of the different innovative opportunities we already have for providing education to our students, whether it be through virtual platforms or the kind of proliferation of pod learning that we've seen. It really was an opportunity for us to, in a moment of crisis, a crisis that arguably continues or may resurge again, shows the innovative techniques that we are already utilizing to do our best to educate our kids. And again, I think also put a magnifying glass on some of the inadequacies or inequities that we do have in our system, which is yet another reason why we need to continue to adequately invest in public education to benefit our students.
Trish, Wilger, how about you?
Yes, I would echo that. I think the pandemic really lit up parent engagement in education overall. Parents saw what their children were working on like never before. They saw the work that they were doing, sometimes not doing, all over the board, that parents could see exactly what that day-to-day education life is like for their child, which you ordinarily would not at all. So I think it just really lit up parents to take more interest in their child's education than ever before. Obviously, some of that was foisted upon them, but learning what their kids were engaged in on a day-to-day basis. It was just such a unique opportunity for parents to see what was going on. So I think that has really brought parents to take a greater interest level in their child's education, so that this call for more school choice, especially for lower income families, has just really come to a groundswell here over the past 2 to 3 years since this pandemic started. So I think it's really lit up school choice across the country from a parent grassroots level, which I think is where it needed to come from.
Right. Margaret, Buckton.
I tell you, I am so excited about the innovations in instruction that the pandemic brought about. And, it's like whenever there's an amazing emergency, I think people step forward and do their best to make sure kids are taken care of. And we saw bus drivers delivering lunches to students. We saw teachers connecting with students in the evening, because that's when they could, changing the way we deliver instruction. And there's not one instructional model that's good for every kid. I think all of us agree with that and have mentioned that. So how do we make sure we have all those choices available to students? And I saw our public schools come through with a lot of different ways of delivering education to students that I hope is going to, net some improved results going forward.
All right, I'm going to shift a little bit and turn it over here. We have a couple of viewer questions, so thank you for those. And as a reminder for those folks who are listening in, if you didn't catch me early in the panel here, if you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll try to get to it. This is a good one, and Margaret, will stay with you because it gets back to that topic of rural districts. And I think I have the start to the answer to this, but then I'll let you help me finish. So the question says, Iowa's rural communities are already suffering. Communities have consolidated rural districts, creating busing and transportation issues. Will the state backfill rural districts and rural communities when students leave public schools and those dollars are shifted to private education? If I remember this right, and Margaret or anyone else correct me if I'm wrong, at one point in the legislative negotiations on this proposal, there was a version that would have sent some percentage of those dollars, and I don't remember the exact numbers, into a fund that would help rural schools that might lose students and thus lose revenue to this. Is that right, Margaret? And then I see you nodding, so it sounds like I'm at least close to the mark. And then be curious to get your perspective on how helpful you thought that was.
Sure. There were two different iterations. The first one was just an enrollment supplement to small districts below 500. And then that changed in the Senate version to an operational sharing fund. And many of our rural districts get to receive additional supplementary funding if they share positions, like they share a superintendent in between two districts, or they might share a curriculum director or a transportation director. And right now, that sharing is capped at the equivalent of what 21 students would generate. So what the bill did was allowed you to count up to 3 more students, but there was a lot of process that you had to go through the bureaucracy of the school budget review committee to ask for permission and demonstrate that you needed it. And when it was all said and done, our rural school advocates of Iowa, even though we certainly support extension of those operational sharing incentives, didn't see that policy in that bill as outweighing all of the concerns that we had about expansion of education savings accounts in Iowa.
So if I can summarize, and correct me if I'm mishearing you, did a helpful provision, but not enough to overall address the concerns in the bill. Is that right, Margaret?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We just prefer that they would extend the operational sharing incentives and increase the weighting available, and we don't have to take on another layer of school choice in order to help our rural schools with that.
Okay. All right. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add to that before I go on to the next question? Hearing none. All right. Good. You covered it all. Good job, Margaret. Another question that just came in, and I suspect this one is probably more pointed for Melissa and Margaret. This question says, we pulled our daughter out of public school because we wanted her in face-to-face education versus virtual. We had 0 options other than to put her in private school because we had passed the March 1st date of an open enrollment being an option. We considered taking out a loan to pay for the private education because we felt virtual was not going to work for her. We were stuck. I would like your input. And the one thing I will note on this, and we mentioned it earlier, the state has since passed a law on the open enrollment where now students and families can do that at any point, but that is brand new. So assuming that this obviously happened before that law was in place and that wasn't an option, then Melissa or Margaret, and I'm sure there are other families like this who do feel stuck in with options. What do you say to them?
So I'll just start out and say, I will say we actually did a wonderful job, I believe, as a state of deferring to local control when it came to opening safely back up our schools, addressing the pandemic situation at the time. I appreciate that there was 1 or 2 school districts that did use a virtual platform exclusively for their students longer than others. But I will say there have always been good cause exemptions to the previous March 1st deadline for open enrollment. And so I'm, apologize if this person found themselves in the perfect storm of a place where that was not an option for them as well. But I do think as much as we were not huge fans of the lack of public input that was taken related to that elimination of the March 1st deadline related to open enrollment. It does sound like this person's concerns would have been addressed at this time. But again, I think we also have to take into consideration some of these options will only be options available to individuals who have access to a non-public school option. So I don't know that the governor's proposal would have solved this person's problem any faster either.
Yeah, and I would also say, and I would defer to Trish and Drew to talk about what other kind of resources private schools may have to help parents in situations where they're stretched like that, beyond the school tuition organization tax credit or the tuition and textbook tax credit, those other things already on the books from a tax perspective. But I also think, I mean, we were in an incredible situation that reversed itself almost as quickly as it descended upon us. So even those two districts that had longer virtual learning, one of them was Cedar Rapids because of the derecho, and they had no choice, they had no buildings. With Des Moines, they had students back in schools by the end of October. And it was very short. I mean, in hindsight, you think about that period of time, it created so much tension for everybody. But schools did, I thought, a reasonably good job of dealing with the pressures of trying to preserve public health under that environment. And especially in urban centers, if you've got 32 students in a classroom, it's really hard to maintain that 6 feet of personal space.
All right.
You know, I would just say that this is not, unfortunately, the first example I've heard of people contemplating and other people who have actually taken out personal loans to go pay for an education elsewhere. And it's a myriad of reasons. It's, they watch a student regress academically, or, they're the victims of persistent bullying, or any number of cases that I've heard of parents that have had to make those choices. And I think that speaks to the need for greater choice, quite frankly. The fact that a parent would consume a loan product, would shoulder the burden of debt that they don't yet know how they're going to pay off to put their kid in a better environment to receive their education, I think says back to some of the previous discussion that we don't yet have the right formula to fund that or to provide the kind of access that every family deserves in the state of Iowa.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left. I appreciate everyone who joined us for the panel discussion here. It was a great discussion. I think we got a lot of perspectives here. I want to give everybody time to give kind of a closing thought here. Trish, Wilger, I'll start with you. So I'll give you a quick second. I'll ramble here to give you a second to come up with your closing arguments since I'm making you go first. But in the meantime, again, I appreciate everybody for being here this morning, and I appreciate everyone who listened in. We've got more Iowa ideas throughout the day today and day two. So if you see any other topics on that schedule, please stick around and stay involved in the conversation with us. So we got just a couple minutes left here. So at about 30 seconds a piece, and I won't stopwatch you, but get closing thoughts from our panelists here. Margaret, Wilger with Iowa Advocates for Choice in Education. We'll start with you.
Thank you, Erin. I would just say in closing that I would hope that as we move forward with this, we could look to focus on kids and parents and educating our community in the best way possible. I know there's a lot of discussion of public versus private here. I'm hopeful that we can move to more of a viewpoint of how can we get children educated in the best way possible? How can we give parents options, knowing, as Margaret said, kids learn differently, different models work for different people. Parents want different things for their children. Parents sometimes even want different things among their own kids. Some kids go to public, some kids go to private in the same family. So I'm just hopeful and would encourage everyone that if we could take a look at this from a community perspective and take the public versus private conflict out of this as we move forward.
All right. Thank you, Trish. Margaret Buckton with Rural School Advocates of Iowa and the Urban School Network.
You bet. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. It's been a great discussion. I think it's important for us to remember our state quarter. This is Foundation in Education. And it really is about making sure that every student has what they need in a world of fixed public policy choices. We don't have infinite resource, so we have to be smart in where we invest it. And I think we need to take a little time and see how the recent expansions of school choice that might have helped that parent we just talked about play out before we take any further steps.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. Drew Klein with Americans for Prosperity.
No, I appreciate this discussion, and obviously I anticipate that we're going to continue having this discussion as a state as we move forward in the coming months. I'm excited because it seems like we have more people participating in that discussion than ever before as parents step up and enter the fray as well.
All right, very good. And bringing us home, Melissa Peterson with the Iowa State Education Association.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, and to my fellow panelists. I do appreciate the conversation. I would just 100% agree with Trish. We need to put the students at the center of this conversation and make sure we are providing the best education opportunities for the most students possible. And that includes the nearly 500,000 folks we've got in our public education system. We need to be responsible with those resources and provide kids with a quality opportunity regardless of those circumstances, which is why we think the investment needs to remain in public education.
All right. Thank you again so much to our panelists for joining us this morning, taking out their time. Very much appreciate that. Thank you all who joined us and listened in. And to everybody, have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all.
Thank you.